Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a circle friendship card to share with you using I'll Always Choose You. So let's get started. This is the I'll Always Choose You stamp set. It's such an adorable set. So I'm using the two little beavers hugging there, and I'm going to stamp it down onto some smooth white cardstock with black ink. I'm using the Mini Misty so that I can stamp it twice. I have pretty much got into the habit of stamping stamped images twice in terms of ones with kind of black lines. I just find that I do get a really nice dark impression, and I like having those lines quite dark. Obviously, if you're doing something different like no line colouring or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily want the lines to be that dark, but I do quite like them being quite nice, crisp, dark lines. I'm then going to colour the image with Copic markers, and I'm starting off in the darkest areas. So I want the tail, their feet and also their noses to be the darkest. So I'm going in with my darkest shade, which is E49. And I'm kind of just mapping out the darker areas on those particular dark areas. So I'm bringing up this E49 a bit higher than I actually would want to necessarily, because when I add the shade on top, which is the lighter shade, it's going to lighten up some of that E49. So I want to make sure that I've got it up high enough so that I can account for the fact that it is going to lighten up slightly. And so then I've still got enough of the darker area. You can definitely go back in afterwards and do multiple layers, but I try where possible to try and kind of like overlap the colours. So I'm now going in with E47 and I'm blending that out. And as you can see, I'm going over where some of the E49 was, but I'm not going all the way to the bottom, because I don't want to lighten that area up. I want that to still be really dark, but the area kind of in between the two shades I want to be lighter. So where those two blend, I'll get a lighter shade, and then as I bring the colour up further, I will get an even lighter shade, which is kind of like the true E47. And that's just how I personally like to blend. So I can go in with all the other areas, and then for my lightest shade in these areas I'm using E44. Now this is a bit more of kind of like a duller kind of brown, I suppose. The E47 I would say is a little bit more of a warm tone, but they do still blend really nicely together. So I'm just taking my time just to blend those colours together. I can do the feet there, and then I can finish off with their noses. And then I'm going to jump back to the E47 and I'm going to use that to map out the darkest areas on their bodies. So I'm just going to go around all of the outside areas where I think would be the darkest. I am kind of focusing the darkest shades sort of on either side of the animals, because they're kind of like rounded, I suppose. You would get more of a shadow on either side of them. So I'm then going in with the E44 again and blending that out. And then I'm going to go in with the E43 and blend that out further. So going over where I've already been with the E44 and then pushing that colour out further. And then my lightest shade for the bulk of the beavers is the E42. So again, I can just blend that out. And then I am leaving a little bit more of a highlight on the smaller beaver, because I'm going to go in with the lighter shade, which is E41. And I do go over the nose here, so it does lighten it up a little bit. I didn't think it lightened it up enough that I was going to end up going over it again, but I could definitely do that if it lightened up too much. And then for their tummy areas, I want them to be quite light, but I do want some shadows on them. So I'm first going in with the E43. I'm then blending that out with the E42. And I do go back over the face here. I did actually go over his teeth, so I do try and sort that out a little bit later. So I'm going in here with the E41, and then I'm using the colourless blender to blend that out, kind of like fade it out to white. And also if I've gone over any lines, which I didn't want to, I'm also using the colourless blender to try and push that colour back in. For the inside of the ears, I'm using R01. And then for the wood log and also the branch, I'm using some warmer shades of brown. So this is the E59 that I'm going in as my darkest shade, blending that out with the E57. And then I'm finishing off with the E55. And on this tiny little bit here on the branch, I did go over the outside. So again, I'm using that zero colourless blender to try and push that colour back in. And then for the leaves, I first start off with YG17 and then I go in with G29, which is my darkest shade. Then I'm going over that with YG23 and then finishing off with YG01. And that pretty much is my favourite green colour combination for leaves. And then for his teeth, because I did accidentally go over that with the browns, I'm going back in with the colourless blender, but I'm kind of dabbing it and then also leaving the tip of the marker directly on the image for a little while, not for too long because it might blend it out too much, but I did lighten up the teeth enough that I was happy with them. I'm then taking the coordinating dynamics, placing that over the top of the image and holding it down with some low tack tape. I run that through my die cutting machine and now I've got the cute little image all die cut out. I then thought it would be quite good to make a circle card because I thought this image would work quite nicely. So I cut one of the A2 circle stacks dynamics, and this one is 3.5 inches in diameter, and I want to add some kind of like a background to it. So I'm using some distress inks and I'm going to create some grass and a sky. So I went in with Twisted Citron to start with, then Mowed Lawn, and then a little bit of Rustic Wilderness. And I'm just seeing here if I've got the grass high enough, and I think I have. So I can go in with the sky, and for this I'm using Mermaid Lagoon, and I'm just using some ink blending brushes here, as you can see, and I'm just focusing most of the colour on either side, so I'm lightening up as it goes down towards the grass. And so there is kind of like a white in between, but it doesn't necessarily read as white, just that it's quite a lot lighter. I'm then bringing in the cloud stencil, and although this isn't going to necessarily look as good as it would do if I was to do it without the kind of ink blending layer underneath, I do like to have the top of the clouds be quite a lot lighter than the bottom, but I just wanted some added interest onto the panel, and I'm just going to add 2 clouds here. So I just rotate the stencil and then I'm just adding that ink blending back on top. And although the bottom of the cloud is still darker, it's not quite how I would usually do clouds, but I still think it turned out quite nice. And then once the image is on top, I think it just adds that added interest to the background. I'm then going to work on the sentiment, and the sentiment that I'm using here says thanks for being my friend, and although I love it as is, it is a little bit big to fit on my circle card. So I'm going to cut it down so that I can just have it say thanks my friend. I would ordinarily have a comma after the word thanks, but it didn't bother me enough that I didn't still do it. So I'm just prepping my black licorice cardstock here with an anti-static powder tool. I do remove the excess powder and then I'm stamping the image down with Versamark ink, and I am going to stamp it twice so that I can cut out each piece individually. So I can just remove that anti-static powder again, ink up my stamp with Versamark ink, and then I can stamp that down. I'm then going to apply Detail White embossing powder. So I do apply it a few times, tap off the excess, and I can do that for both pieces. And then if I've got any extra embossing powder where I don't want it, I can just use a dry brush to remove that before I heat set it. And I do like to heat from the front and the back. And then once the powder starts melting, then I just move the heat gun quickly over the wood. And then I try not to keep the heat tool in one place for too long because I don't want to overheat that powder. It can make it a little bit grainy. I'm then taking the Itty Bitty Strips Dynamics, and I'm just figuring out here what part of each sentiment looked best. And so for the one on the right hand side, I think the My Friend looked better. I got a little bit of excess powder on the thanks on that one. And then for the other one, I used the thanks word. So I run those through my die cutting machine so that I can cut out the words separately. I'm then going to cut those down further using a mini guillotine, so I can just cut off the sides. And then I've got my sentiment all ready to go. I'm going to create a circle card base. So this actually is an A2 size white card base, so a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. And now I'm taking the 4-inch A2 Circle Stacks Dynamics die, placed it over the top, but I've got a little tiny bit of the die overhanging. This is a way that you can create a circle card. I actually usually do it in a different way and use the hinge method, but for this one I thought I would show you that you can create it from a kind of full card base as well. But I don't really like having that kind of notch hanging out the top, so I've cut another of the dies just from white cardstock so that I can place that over the top. To make sure that the circle card stands up nicely, I am going to cut a little notch from the bottom, but I was worried that I might not cut it straight, so I'm just using my scoreboard here and a stylus tool, and I'm just kind of pushed up the top of the card base on the one side so that I know that when I cut it now with my mini guillotine, it's going to be straight. So I can just cut that little notch off, and that's going to make sure that the card is going to stand up straight, and that's just on the back piece of the card base. I've added some foam tape onto the back of the image, and then I can pop that onto the inked panel. So I'm just using some tweezers here just to help me out with the placement. I just want to try and make sure that I get the beavers somewhat straight on this circle. So I did bring in my sentiment, just although I haven't kind of placed it down properly, I just wanted to kind of see how long it was. So once I'm happy with that placement, I can press that down. I've then added some tape runner adhesive onto the back of that circle piece that I'm going to add onto the front of the card base. And I'm just using what nails I have just to remove any of the excess little bits of cardstock that hang around when after die cutting. So I've opened up my card base here, and I'm using the grid lines on my mat so that I can make sure that my card is placed down straight. I've added some more foam tape onto the back of the panel, and now I can try and line up this panel on the card base as straight as possible. So I'm just taking my time, kind of hovering it over the card base to start with, and then once I'm happy I can press that down. I've added some foam tape onto the back of the sentiment strips, and I'm using again the grid lines on my mat so that I can line up a ruler so that I can try and get the sentiment straight as well. And then for the one at the top, I can just use the sentiment at the bottom to make sure the top one is straight. I'm then going to finish off with a few embellishments. So I'm starting off by adding some small dabs of the On Point Precision Glue, and I'm going to add some clear droplets on top. And I'm just adding 3 of those around the sentiments. So just trying to push them underneath the sentiment strips, and then I can add another one here at the bottom. And once the glue dries, it's going to dry completely clear. I'm then adding in the white highlights back on their eyes using a 0.5 Jelly Roll pen, and then I'm also using the white Jelly Roll pen in the 0.8 to add some kind of highlights onto the image as well. So I tend to do a line and then a few dots afterwards. And ordinarily I would add these highlights into the lighter areas, but I decided for this image that I would just do them wherever I wanted to, even in the darker areas. So I'm just adding a few around. I do sometimes think that you can add too many on an image, but I was okay with how many I added on this occasion. I'm then adding some clear glaze pen onto their noses, and once that dries, that's going to dry nice and shiny as well. So that's the card finished for today. Like you can see, it stands up really nicely. I do think that image works really well for a circle card because although it adds a big impact onto the card, it is a bit of a smaller sized image. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description box here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.